All right, folks. So here's what we're trying to do today is we're trying to give you a little bit of background on the documents, the people, and the events that created a climate where loyal colonists, loyal citizens of Great Britain, proud to be citizens of Great Britain, wanted to declare their independence from that country. All right, so our road to independence starts with the Magna Carta, Magna Carta, originally signed in 1215. So that the events behind this were there were a group of barons that cornered King John at Runnymede and forced him to give up some of his power as the sovereign, as the King of England. The key thing you always want to remember with Magna Carta is that it established the concept of rule of law, that nobody, not even the king, is above the law. And that is one of the tenets that we live by under our current government system also, that the president himself is not above the law and is subject to the law. The other thing you want to, when we start talking about these British documents, is that they are slowly stripping power away from the king and they're giving it to larger and larger groups of people in the form of rights. So one of the rights we can see in Magna Carta is trial by jury, that it wouldn't be the king that determines whether or not you are guilty of an accused crime, that you would have a jury. There is also due process, the idea that there's a process that you are beholden to, that government has to give you if you are accused of the crime. If they want to take your life, they want to take your property, there's a process they have to follow. That is a right that we trace all the way back to Magna Carta, signed in 1215. And the concept of private property, that your property is yours and government exists to secure that property. It's not necessarily all the property of the king. So specifically, when we look at Magna Carta, we're looking at the judicial powers being stripped from the king and given to other institutions, being given to not all the people, but a small group of like elite clergy and barons in the form of rights. And they also now have those judicial powers as well. When we go on to the next document, the English Petition of Right, you'll note that it's 400 years later, 1628. At this point in time, we see that Parliament as an institution has been established. Okay? And there's a conflict between the king and Parliament. Now, the interesting thing about this conflict is that it does result in the beheading of a king. That's always kind of cool. Right? But what you're going to see here is, again, a list of rights that are being extended to larger groups of people, okay, not just the privileged, not just the landed elite, not just the royalty, okay, but it's being given to all political critics, these rights, right? So you're taking away power from the king, you're giving it to more people in the form of rights. So you'll see that some of these are repeated because they're being extended to larger groups of people. Trial by jury, no martial law in peacetime, so the king can't use the military to rule. Okay, no quartering of troops without consent. That might sound familiar, might come up again later on. And all taxes need the consent of Parliament. The big thing that we see with the English Petition of Right is we're taking another one of those governmental powers away from the King of England, the legislative power, the power to make laws, and we're housing it in Parliament itself. So the king no longer is sovereign and has the ultimate authority to determine what is right and wrong for English men and women. It is Parliament that has sovereignty and has that ultimate power to determine what is right and wrong for English men and women. Okay, but there's a third document, of course, because there's a third power of government, right? So it's just a few short years later, like 60 years or so, and you have the English Bill of Rights. Another war, another conflict, another king beheaded, killed. Yep, this one's even more fun because, Parliament asked the king's daughter and son-in-law to come and invade England itself. So there's all that, family intrigue that's happening as well when we talk about the English Petition of Rights. But eventually, this is William and Mary. They were asked to sign this document in order to become king and queen of England. And you'll see that there's a laundry list of rights here. A lot of them are repeated, but now they're extended to all men and women in England, right? Well, I should say men, not necessarily women at this point, right? Okay, trial by jury, due process, no cruel punishment, the right to petition, okay, to actually make requests of government. That we see that the final power of government has been stripped from the king. He's still going to be the executive authority, but he can't execute the law without the consent of Parliament. So that power is housed in Parliament as well now. Okay? What you see with the English Bill of Rights is you see the turn that the Englishmen are no longer considered just subjects, okay, and just have responsibilities to government, but they are now citizens that have rights that government has to abide by, limits on governmental power. So in 1689, if you were an English citizen, you were like, hey, we're the best country in the world. We basically have rights. We have protections that government is going to give us. We're citizens. We're not just subjects. And they looked at all the other countries in Europe and said, you're subject, you're subject, you're subject, loser, loser, loser. We're not. We're not losers. We're the best country in the world. And that's kind of where our story starts, is that you have these colonists over in North America that think of themselves as the best country in the world. And they go from that period of time, over a short period of time, saying, no, our country sucks and we want our own government. All right, so let's move on in our story. So this period of time, we've already talked about these philosophers at this point. You'll note that Thomas Hobbes is not on this list because he's kind of a pre-Enlightenment philosopher. He didn't really go down very far down the road in extending power to the people. So the big thing that emerges from the Enlightenment that you need to understand is that people are questioning traditional authority. Okay, and whether, really does it make sense that a supreme executive power would be on the basis of blood, that'd be passed down through a bloodline, or that extreme executive power is going to be given to you by a god? They said no. Extreme executive power, okay, governmental authority comes from the people. That's the idea of popular sovereignty, that people consent for government to have power over them, and it's a contract. You get something in return. You give up freedom, you get your rights secured. That was one of the big ideas behind John Locke, as we saw. Jean-Jacques Rousseau extends that thinking a little bit further in 1762 with his ideas of the social contract. But you'll find that it's John Locke that really had the most influence on the founders of our country. So that period of 1609 to 1760, that's that period of time when the colonists thought of themselves as being the best country in the world. We got the best government. We're citizens. We're not subjects. We have rights. It's also a period of time where they were left to govern themselves. That's like, 150 years where they developed traditions and expectations of self-control, of self-government. They were left to do what they wanted to. They taxed themselves. They weren't taxed by England. They taxed themselves. Also, these colonies, all 13 colonies, were distinctly different in many different ways: geography, industry, religion, culture, the way that they were created. That's the charters. You think of those as the constitutions, the documents that created each of these little colonies, different. Okay, so they were just different. It was very hard for them to organize and work together because they were so different. But they did have that common tradition of self-control and self-government that was established over a 150-year period. So, now in blue here, whenever we get to an event that's in blue, you're talking about a colonist response. The people living in North America, what's something they did, okay? So very early on in 1754, Ben Franklin thought, it might be a good idea if we actually kind of unified a little bit. We got 13 separate colonies all working, doing their own thing, and we have some universal problems that we need to address. How about we get together occasionally and talk about our problems and come up with a plan? Now, unfortunately, the Albany Plan of Union didn't happen because a war broke out, a world war. Now, if we're talking about events you need to know, this is one you need to know. The French and Indian War is what we call it here in North America. The worldwide conflict was called the 7 Years' War, even though it was longer than 7 years, right? It was a war between England and France. It was a worldwide conflict. England won. They kicked France out of North America. They kicked Spain out of Florida, but they went severely into debt doing so, okay? So moving forward, you're going to see that Great Britain is trying to recoup the cost. They're trying to get out of debt, right? And how does a country get out of debt? Well, they tax its citizens, right? Now, from the colonist perspective, they were asked to fight in this war. So they fought to help defend England in North America, okay? They defended the colonies in battles with the French in North America. So after the ending of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, One of the first things that so when you see the color red, it's an action that Great Britain took. So Proclamation of 1763, don't really need to know it, just it's kind of the beginning of the story. It's Great Britain saying, you know what, don't settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, which made the colonists mad. They wanted to, they won the war, they wanted to expand into that French territory. Great Britain was afraid that it would cause conflict with the Native American tribes, and they didn't have the resources to actually fight another war. So they were trying to avoid another war when they made this proclamation. Okay. Sugar Act of 1764 was an attempt by the British Parliament to pay for the French and Indian War. It was like the first tax that came after the French and Indian War, tax on rum, and it was just trying to raise money to pay for the war. Okay. It did, kind of increase the naval presence here in the colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 is the one you need to know, because that was the first time that the British Parliament attempted to directly tax the colonists. It impacted every American, regardless of social status. Everybody would have to pay this tax because it was a tax on all paper goods. Whether you want a newspaper, a marriage license, a will, a mortgage, or you were just a dock worker that liked to play cards in the bar, you had to pay a tax on the playing cards themselves. Okay, now the British thought, hey, Americans are going to be fine with this because we defended them in the French and Indian War. British citizens are already used to paying a stamp tax. Little did they know that 150-year tradition of self-governance, of taxing themselves, of governing themselves, is going to have a huge impact on the colonists' response to this attempt to take that power away from them. So you'll see here, you have some actions in blue that the colonists did in response to the Stamp Act, and these aren't necessarily legal actions. They hung the stamp collector in effigy, so they make dolls of the stamp collector and they hang it to basically as a threat of violence. There was actually violence that played out. There were riots, people rioting in the streets. There was property damage. There was the emergence of the Sons of Liberties. And if you're someone living in England and Great Britain, you looked at the Sons of Liberty and you thought they were a terrorist organization. They're running around organizing these riots, organizing this vandalism that was occurring. They're the ones that are making the threats of violence by hanging these dolls of the stamp collector in town squares, right? There you go. Okay, now, you also had more legitimate, more legal reactions that were happening in the colonies as well. So they got together, 9 of the 13 colonies showed up at a Congress called the Stamp Act Congress to say, you know what, we don't like this law, we don't like this tax. How can we get England to listen to our desires that they should repeal it and get rid of it? So they sent a letter, they organized a boycott where they refused to buy British goods, and it was effective, okay? Because of these legal things that happened, the Stamp Act was actually repealed, okay? Not a single tax was collected, okay? And if that had been the end of the story, we never would have had a revolution, right? But it wasn't the end of the story. So on the very same day that the British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, they passed the Declaratory Act, which really in effect did nothing except for it claimed sovereignty. They said, you know what? We ultimately have the power to make decisions for the colonies. Even though you've been governing yourself for 150 years, we ultimately are sovereign, okay? So very shortly after the Declaratory Act, it passed the Townshend Acts, which was another attempt just to collect money to help pay the debt from the French and Indian War. Okay, it was a different type of tax. It was not direct, so they thought maybe the colonists would be willing to pay it. Okay, but they didn't. At this point, the colonists were like, you can't govern us. You are not, we have a tradition of governing ourselves. So again, there were these extra legal actions that the Sons of Liberty took. Okay, so people were being tarred and feathered, which is basically murder. Acts of murder were being committed against tax collectors. And if you're a government, can you let your government officials be killed? You can't. So the response to that is the British sent troops to Massachusetts. So all of a sudden, there's more of a military presence in the colonies. You're going to see things escalating. Okay? And it wasn't just because of the one attempt to tax the colonies. It was a series of attempts where the British government were reminding the colonies who's in charge. Okay? Now, from the British perspective, up until this point, they're pretty much just trying to raise revenue. That's all they want to do is get money to get out of debt because of the worldwide conflict that was the French and Indian War. All right, so during this period of time, you've often heard the Boston Massacre. You'll note that that's in blue because there's always going to be different perceptions of the same event. In England, they called it the incident on King Street. You'll note the very radical difference between the use of the terms massacre and incident. If I call something an incident, you don't really think of it as a massacre. When I think of massacre, I think of a lot of people being killed unfairly, right? Now, this event was actually orchestrated by the Sons of Liberty. Okay? British soldiers fired into a crowd, injuring 6, killing 5 people. It was used as propaganda by the Sons of Liberty to actually unify the colonies, to bring those vastly different 13 colonies together. Okay? Here you see 2 images. The image on the left was made by Paul Revere, and this is a piece of propaganda. Okay, so you'll see that the British soldiers there are all in a line. Someone's back there telling them to fire into an unarmed crowd of people, right? And so that's the massacre. On the right over here, you'll see it more as an incident. You got a mob with weapons that are surrounding the British soldiers, and it looks like the British soldiers are really just trying to defend themselves, right? So that's the incident on King Street. Regardless of how it really played out, it was used as propaganda to unify the colonies. Then you get the Tea Act. Again, probably your last attempt by the British to just raise revenue. Okay? You're a very familiar thing. They're just trying to raise some money to help pay off the debt from the French and Indian War. However, the Sons of Liberty organized the Boston Tea Party, which was an act of destruction. They went onto the boats and they dumped the tea into the Boston Harbor. Immediately, the British blockades the port of Boston, and they established military rule in Massachusetts. It's this event that causes a different reaction from the British government. At this point, after the Boston Tea Party, they're no longer interested in collecting money from the colonies. Now it's about punishing the colonies. So in 1774, they passed the Coercive Acts, which was several different laws that did these things. All of them were designed to punish the colonies. They closed Boston Harbor. They got rid of the self-government. So the Massachusetts legislature, they said, nope, you're not governing yourselves anymore. They allowed troops to be quartered in the homes in Massachusetts. You'll note that was a violation of the Petition of Right from way back when, right? More troops are being sent to Massachusetts, and to make things, just to put the cherry right on top of the ice cream right there, is they gave Quebec to Canada. So that French Indian War, that land that we won, fighting on behalf of Great Britain, they gave it to Canada, okay? That was like the last straw there. Now, in the United States, well, in the colonies, I should say, we call them the Intolerable Acts. That these were intolerable actions taken by the British government that violated the rights that were given to us in Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and the English Bill of Rights. Okay, that government's no longer securing those rights. They are violating the things that they are supposed to secure. So, in response to the Intolerable Acts, we have our first Continental Congress, which is a meeting between the colonies. 12 of 13 colonies showed up. Georgia was not there. The key for Massachusetts was to get all the other 11 colonies there to see themselves as the next Massachusetts. To say, you know what, your colony could be next. And they were effective in doing that. So at the first Continental Congress, the key thing is it went from being 13 separate protest movements to one movement, one voice speaking against the oppressions, or what they thought of as oppressions, by the British government. Now, what did they actually do? They sent a Declaration of Rights to the British government saying, hey, please don't do these things. Could you secure our rights rather than violate them? They organized a boycott again because that was effective in the repealment of the Stamp Act. And then they did some extra legal things, some things that would make, if you're a British government official, they make you very nervous. Like they hunted down loyalists. That was called Tory hunts. And again, tarred and feathered loyal British citizens, like committed acts of murder. Each colony formed its own independent militia. So all of a sudden, the colonists are arming themselves. They're forming armies. They're stealing gunpowder and guns. And you know what? If you're a government, you can't let people do that. Right? So they saw it as an illegitimate body. And then we get to the shot heard round the world, right? You've probably seen the Schoolhouse Rocks video, Paul Revere's bride, yada, 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 shots are fired, okay? So you get to basically the battles of Concord and Lexington, and 269 British soldiers are killed or wounded, right? So after the end of the First Continental Congress, it ended, they said, you know what, in a year's time, we'll get together, we'll see if things got better. But by the time they got together at the Second Continental Congress in May of 1775, shots had already been fired. Blood had already been spilled. Okay? So when they passed the Olive Branch Petition, which was like the last effort, the last time that the colonies reached out to the British government and said, hey, can we avoid conflict? Can you just agree to honor our rights? And, basically not have military rule in the colonies. That'd be nice. Okay? Well, what they did is they formed a national army. They appointed George Washington as its general, and the Second Continental Congress ends up functioning as our first national government. Okay, all 13 colonies are there at this point. It's here at the Second Continental. Almost forgot this. Big thing here, common sense. Okay, so you have a pamphlet that was written by Thomas Paine. The reason we always talk about common sense is up until this point, you're really talking about an elite movement. So it was the economic elite. It was the business elite. It was the educated elite that were talking about independence. Thomas Paine comes along and he translates those arguments into language that the common, normal, everyday person understands. That if government doesn't give you your basic rights, you got a right to go get a new government. He was taking what John Locke had said in the Second Treatise of Government and putting it into language that your normal, everyday person understood. So Thomas Paine, we can credit with taking this elite movement and making it a broad social movement. So people in the bars, on the dock sides, were talking about independence as well. And not just people drinking tea, sitting around in their little things that tea drinkers sit around in, right? Okay, so back to the Second Continental Congress. June 7th, 1776, Richard Henry Lee, a Virginian, big strapping man, 6'6" or something like that, with a deep voice, probably full of muscles too, right? Stands up, motions for independence. Then on July 2nd, okay, the vote for independence is held and it's passed. So we actually declare independence on July 2nd. Thomas Jefferson's draft of the original Declaration of Independence is edited by the Second Continental Congress as a whole. They take out a whole section where he basically accused the king of the slave trade. They said, you know what, we're not ready to go there yet, and they take that part out. Our country might have been different if that part of the Declaration of Independence had been left in. Okay. Well, the final draft of the Declaration of Independence is adopted on July 4th. Thus, we celebrate the holiday. However, it was a month later, on August 2nd, that they came back and signed it. Okay, so that's how we get to independence. Those are the events that led to independence. Make sure you know the three British documents: Magna Carta, English Petition of Right, English Bill of Rights. Just that they stripped power from the king, gave it to larger and larger groups of people in the form of rights. Okay. Know the events of the French Indian War, the Stamp Act, and then the Continental Congresses, the First and the Second Continental Congress. What's the key thing that happened at the Second Continental Congress? We declared independence. Pretty straightforward. What functioned as our first national government? The Second Continental Congress. That's right. All right, you got this. We'll talk to you all later. Bye.